Alexander Dugin, Last War of the World Island, The Geopolitics of Contemporary Russia, London, Arctos 2015. Copyright 2015 by Arctos Media Ltd. All rights reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced or utilized in any form or by any means, whether electronic or mechanical, including photocopying, recording, or by any information storage and retrieval system, without permission in writing from the publisher. First English edition published in 2015 by Arctos Media Limited, ISBN 978-1-91052437-4, Srcinally published as Geopolitika Rossii, Moscow, Gaudiamus, 2012. Translator John Bryant. Editors John B. Morgan. Cover design Andreas Nilsson. Layout Tor Westman. Arctos Media Ltd. www.arctos.com. Contents. Editors Note. Tor de Geopolitics of Russia's Future. Theoretical Problems of the Creation of a Fully Fledged Russian Geopolitics. Geopolitical Apperception. Heartland Russia as a Civilization of Land. The Geopolitical Continuity of the Russian Federation. The Russian Federation and the Geopolitical Map of the World. The Geopolitics of the USSR. The Geopolitical background of the 1917 Revolution. The geopolitics of the Civil War. The geopolitical balance of power in the Peace of Versailles. The geopolitics and sociology of the early Stalin period. The geopolitics of the Great Patriotic War. The geopolitical outcomes of the Great Patriotic War. The geopolitics of the Yalta world and the Cold War. The Yalta world after the death of Stalin. Theories of convergence and globalism. The geopolitics of perestroika. The geopolitical significance of the collapse of the USSR. The geopolitics of Yeltsin's Russia and its sociological significance. The Great Loss of Rome, the vision of G.K. Chesterton. The first stage of the collapse, the weakening of Soviet influence in the global leftist movement. The second stage of the collapse, the end of the Warsaw Pact. The third stage of the collapse, the State Committee on the State of Emergency and the end of the USSR. The Bialoia Forest. The unipolar moment. The geopolitics of the unipolar world, center periphery. The geopolitics of the neoconservatives. The Kozyrev Doctrine. The contours of Russia's collapse. The establishment of a Russian school of geopolitics. The geopolitics of the political crises of October 1993. The change in Yeltsin's views after the conflict with parliament. The first Chechen campaign. The geopolitical outcomes of the Yeltsin administration. The geopolitics of the 2000s. The phenomenon of Putin. The structure of the poles of force in Chechnya in 1996-1999. The geopolitics of Islam. The bombing of homes in Moscow, the incursion into Dagestan, and Putin's coming to power. The Second Chechen War. The geopolitical significance of Putin's reforms. September 11, geopolitical consequences and Putin's response. The Paris-Berlin-Moscow axis. The Atlanticist network of influence in Putin's Russia. The post-Soviet space integration. The geopolitics of the color revolutions. The Munich speech. Operation Medvedev-Saakashvili's assault on Tskhinvali and the Russia-Georgian War of 2008. The reset and the return to Atlanticism. The Eurasian Union. The outcomes of the geopolitics of the 2000s. The point of bifurcation in the geopolitical history of Russia. Editors Note: this book was Srcinally published in Russian in 2012. Although the geopolitical situation of Russia has changed considerably since then, especially as regards the Ukrainian crisis and the subsequent outbreak of war in eastern Ukraine, Alexander Dugin has made it clear that he stands by his Srcinal assessment and criticism of Putin's approach, and that only by Russia's assertion of itself as a land-based regional power in opposition to the sea-based Atlanticism of the United States and NATO can Russia survive in any genuine sense. Footnotes that were added by me are denoted with an ed following them, and those that were added by the translator are denoted with tr. Those which were part of the Srcinal Russian text have no notation. Where sources in other languages have been cited, I have attempted to replace them with existing English language editions. Citations to works for which I could locate no translation are retained in their Srcinal language. Website addresses for online sources were verified as accurate and available during the period of April and May 2015. John B. Morgan for Budapest, Hungary, May 2015. Chapter I. Tour de Geopolitics of Russia's Future. Theoretical Problems of the Creation of a Fully Fledged Russian Geopolitics. The geopolitics of Russia is not the mere application of a geopolitical arsenal to the Russian government. In other words, Russian geopolitics cannot be created from without, as the simple, mechanical application of universal laws to a concrete and well-defined object. The problem is that a Russian geopolitics is possible only on the basis of a deep study of Russian society, both its present and its past. Before drawing conclusions about how the Russian government is correlated with territory, we should study Russian society scrupulously and thoroughly in its structural constants, and especially trace the formation and evolution of Russians' views about the surrounding world. That is, we should study how Russians understand and interpret the surrounding world and its environment. The problem is not only to learn about the geographical structure of the Russian territories, contemporary or historical, that is important, but insufficient. We must clarify how Russian society understood and interpreted the structure of these territories at different times, what it considered its own, what as alien, and how the awareness of borders, cultural, and civilizational identity, and the relationship to those ethnoses and narratives living in neighboring territories changed. The views of Russian society, on the basis of which the Soviet society and in our time that of the Russian Federation were formed, 3 about territorial space have been insufficiently studied, and as a result this most important factor in the creation of a full-fledged Russian geopolitics is for the moment only available to us fragmentally and episodically. Further, the question of the attitude of Russian society toward political forms and types of government remains open. If in the Marxist period we were guided by the theory of progress and the shifts of political economic blocs, and considered the experience of the Western European countries as universal, then today this reductionist schema is no longer suitable. We must build a new model of Russian socio-political history, study the logic of that history, and propose structural generalities that reflect the peculiarities characteristic of our society's relations, at different historical stages, to other governmental and political systems. And in this case, alas, we have but a few relevant works, since Marxist theories yield notorious caricatures, based on exaggerations and violence against the historical facts and especially against their significance. The same is true of the application of liberal Western methods to Russian history and to Russian society. These difficulties must not dishearten us. The intuitively obvious moments of Russian social history, observations about the peculiarities of Russian culture, and the very structure of the geopolitical discipline can be reference points for the movement toward the creation of a full-fledged Russian geopolitics. Such an approximate representation of Russian society will be enough to begin with. Geopolitical apperception. Classical geopolitics, both Anglo-Saxon and European, gives us some fundamental prompts for the construction of a Russian geopolitics. We can accept them unreservedly. However, in this case an important factor interferes, whose significance is great in non-classical physics, both for Einstein and for Bohr, but even more appreciable in geopolitics. The geopolitical system depends on the position of the observer and interpreter, for it is not enough to agree with the geopolitical features that classical geopolitics attributes to Russia. We should accept those features and view our history and our culture as their confirmation. That is, we should grasp ourselves as products of that geopolitical system. In a word, we should understand ourselves not as a neutral observer, but as an observer embedded in a historical and spatial context. This procedure is usually called geopolitical apperception. Geopolitical apperception is the ability to perceive the totality of geopolitical factors consciously, with an explicit understanding of both our subjective position and the regularities of the structure of what we perceive. The notion of a Russian geopolitician does not signify only citizenship and a particular sphere of professional knowledge. It is something much deeper. A Russian geopolitician is an exponent of geopolitical views and the carrier of historical, social and strategic constants that are historically characteristic of Russian society, today, that of the Russian Federation. Geopolitics permits 2 global positions 5v, Mawak K. Inaden Rakaonlnsathiam at Gios8 Magnios Poliantixo on adnodes tun Hotlant Kasen Moanals Geointhios positions. He who occupies himself with it first clarifies his own position and its relation to the geopolitical map of the world. This position is neither geographical nor political, having to do with one's citizenship, but socio-cultural, civilizational, and axiological. It touches the geopolitician's own identity. In certain cases, it can be changed, but this change is as serious as a change of one's religious confession or a radical modification of one's political opinions. Heartland classical geopolitics proceeds from the fact that the territory of contemporary Russia, earlier the Soviet Union, USSR, and still earlier the Russian Empire, is the heartland. It is the land-based, telluric, core of the entire Eurasian continent. Mackinder calls this zone the geographical pivot of history, from which the majority of telluric impulses historically issue, from the ancient steppe nomads like the Scythians and Sarmatians to the imperial center of Russian colonization in the 16th through the 19th centuries, or the communist expansion during the Soviet period. Heartland 6 is a typical geopolitical concept. It does not signify belonging to Russia as to its government and does not have an exclusively geographical meaning. In it we are dealing with a spatial meaning, Rom-Sin, according to Efrat Sel, 7, which can become the heritage of the society placed on this territory. In this case it will be perceived and included in the social system and will ultimately express itself in political history. Historically, Russians did not immediately realize the significance of their location and only accepted the baton of tellurocracy after the Mongolian conquests of Genghis Khan, whose empire was a model of tellurocracy. But, beginning from the 15th century, Russia steadily and sequentially moved toward taking on the characteristics of the heartland, which gradually led to the identification of Russian society with the civilization of land, or tellurocracy. The heartland is not characteristic of the culture of Eastern Slavs, but during their historical process, Russians found themselves in this position and adopted a land-based, continental civilizational mark. For that reason, Russian geopolitics is by definition the geopolitics of the heartland, land-based geopolitics, the geopolitics of land. Because of this, we know from the start that Russian society belongs to the land-based type. But how Russia became land-based, what stages we traversed along this path, how this was shown in our understanding of territorial space and the evolution of our spatial representations, and, on the other hand, how it has been reflected in political forms and political ideologies, remains to be thoroughly clarified. This puts an a priori obligation on Russian geopolitics. It must see the world from the position of the civilization of land. Russia as a civilization of land. Here it makes sense to correlate that which falls under heartland and is the core of the civilization of land with the political reality of the contemporary Russian Federation in its existing borders. This correlation itself is exceedingly important. In making it, we correlate Russia in its actual condition with its unchanging geopolitical spatial sense, Rom-Sin. This juxtaposition gives us a few important guidelines for the construction of a full-fledged and sound Russian geopolitics for the future. First, we must think of the contemporary Russian Federation in its current borders as one of the moments of a more extensive historical cycle, during which Eastern Slavic statehood self-identified as the civilization of land and became more and more closely identified with the heartland. This means that contemporary Russia, considered geopolitically, is not something new. It is not just a government that appeared 20-something years ago. It is merely an episode of a long historical process lasting centuries, at each stage bringing Russia closer and closer to becoming an expression of the civilization of land on a planetary scale. Formerly, the Eastern Slavic ethnoses and Kievan Rus 9 were only the periphery of the Orthodox, Eastern Christian civilization and were in the sphere of influence of the Byzantine Empire. This Ofolto en rethalarian vyspyuatan rufstiens minotnik delia inazhtiern po el ruisfia warsoitnik. Lud in the Eurasian geopolitical construct of the land-based, nomadic empire of Genghis Khan, later a peace in the west broke off, as the Golden Horde. 10 The fall of Constantinople and the weakening of the Golden Horde made the great Muscovite Tsardom an heir to two traditions, the political and religious Byzantine one and the traditional Eurasianist one, which passed to the Great Russian princes, and later to the Tsars, from the Mongols. From this moment, the Russians begin to think of themselves as the Third Rome, as the carriers of a special type of civilization, sharply contrasting in all its basic parameters with the Western European, Catholic civilization of the West. Starting from the 15th century, Russians emerged onto the scene of world history as a civilization of land, and all the fundamental geopolitical force lines of its foreign policy from then on had only one goal: the integration of the heartland, the strengthening of its influence in the zone o Northeast Eurasia, and the assertion of its identity in the face of a much more aggressive adversary, Western Europe. From the 18th century, Great Britain and, more broadly, the Anglo-Saxon world, which was in the process of realizing its role as the civilization of the sea, or thalassocracy. In this duel between Russia and England, and later the United States, there unfolds from then on, from the 18th century and until today, the geopolitical logic of world history, the Great War o' Continents. 11. This geopolitical meaning remains, on the whole, unchanging in all later stages of Russian history, from the Muscovite Tsardom through the Romanov Russia of St. Petersburg and the Soviet Union to the current Russian Federation. From the 15th to the 21st century, Russia is a planetary pole of the civilization o land, a continental Rome. The geopolitical continuity of the Russian Federation in all the principal parameters. The Russian Federation is the geopolitical heir to the preceding historical, political, and social forms that took shape around the territory of the Russian plain, Kievan Rus, the Golden Horde, the Muscovite Tsardom, the Russian Empire, and the Soviet Union. This continuity is not only territorial, but also historical, social, spiritual, political, and ethnic. From ancient times, the Russian government began to form in the heartland, gradually expanding, until it occupied the entire heartland and the zones adjoining it. 12. The spatial expansion of Russian control over Eurasian territories was accompanied by a parallel sociological process, the strengthening in Russian society of land-based social arrangements, characteristic of a civilization of the continental type. The fundamental features of this civilization are conservatism, holism, collective anthropology, the narod is more important than the individual, sacrifice, an idealistic orientation, the values of faithfulness, asceticism, honor, and loyalty. Sociology, following Sombart 13, calls this a heroic civilization. According to the sociologist Pitirim Sorokin 14, it is the ideal socio-cultural system. 15. This sociological trait was expressed in various political forms, which had a common denominator: the constant reproduction of civilizational constants and basic values, historically expressed in different ways. The political system of Kievan Rus differs qualitatively from the politics of the Horde, and that, in turn, from the Muscovite Tsardom. After Peter I 16 the political system sharply changed again, and the October Revolution o 1917 also led to the emergence of a radically new type of statehood. After the collapse of the USSR, there arose on the territory of the heartland another government, again differing from the previous ones, today's Russian Federation. But throughout Russian political history, all these political forms, which have countertad ivstordia 50 elnik geiskalen drinker palefso, unadsiat noftkoifm for minotuntarnates.scm virishim hisra direk stil the political expression of the social arrangements characteristic of a society of the continental, land-based, heroic type. These sociological peculiarities emerged in politics through the phenomenon that the philosopher Eurasianists of the 1920s-17 called idiocracy. The ideational model in the socio-cultural sphere, as a general trait of Russian society throughout its history, was expressed in politics as idiocracy, which also had different ideological forms, but preserved a vertical, hierarchical, messianic structure of government. The Russian Federation and the geopolitical map of the world. After fixing the well-defined geopolitical identity of contemporary Russia, we can move to the next stage. Taking into account such a geopolitical analysis, we can precisely determine the place of the contemporary Russian Federation on the geopolitical map of the world. The Russian Federation is in the heartland. The historical structure of Russian society displays vividly expressed teleurocratic traits. Without hesitation, we should associate the Russian Federation, too, with a government of the land-based type, and contemporary Russian society with a mainly holistic society. The consequences of this geopolitical identification are global in scale. On its basis, we can make a series of deductions, which must lie at the basis of a consistent and fully fledged Russian geopolitics of the future. 1. Russia's geopolitical identity, being land-based and tellurocratic, demands strengthening, deepening, acknowledgement, and development. The substantial side of the policy of affirming political sovereignty, declared in the early 2000s by the President of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, consists in precisely this. Russia's political sovereignty is imbued with a much deeper significance. It is the realization of the strategic project for the upkeep of the political administrative unity of the heartland and the creation of the conditions necessary for Russia to act as the tellurocratic pole on a global scale. In strengthening Russia's sovereignty, we strengthen one of the columns of the world's geopolitical architecture. We carry out an operation, much greater in scale than a project of domestic policy concerning only our immediate neighbors, in the best case. Geopolitically, the fact that Russia is the heartland makes its sovereignty a planetary problem. All the powers and states in the world that possess tellurocratic properties depend on whether Russia will cope with this historic challenge and be able to preserve and strengthen its sovereignty. 2. Beyond any ideological preferences, Russia is doomed to conflict with the civilization of the sea, with thalassocracy, embodied today in the USA and the unipolar America-centric world order. Geopolitical dualism has nothing in common with the ideological or economic peculiarities of this or that country. A global geopolitical conflict unfolded between the Russian Empire and the British monarchy, then between the socialist camp and the capitalist camp. Today, during the age of the democratic-republican arrangement, the same conflict is unfolding between democratic Russia and the bloc of the democratic countries of NATO treading upon it. Geopolitical regularities lie deeper than political ideological contradictions or similarities. The discovery of this principal conflict does not automatically mean war or a direct strategic conflict. Conflict can be understood in different ways. From the position of realism in international relations, we are talking about a conflict of interests which leads to war only when one of the sides is sufficiently convinced of the weakness of the other, or when an elite is put at the head of either state that puts national interests above rational calculation. The conflict can also develop peacefully, through a system of a general strategic, economic, technological, and diplomatic balance. Occasionally it can even soften into rivalry and competition, although a forceful resolution can never be consciously ruled out. In such a situation the question of geopolitical security is foremost, and without it no other factors modernization, an increase in the gross domestic product, GDP, or the standard of living, and so forth have independent significance. What is the point of our creating a developed economy if we will lose our geopolitical independence? This is not bellicose, but a healthy rational analysis in a realist spirit. This is geopolitical realism. 3. Geopolitically, Russia is something more than the Russian Federation in its current administrative borders. The Eurasian civilization, established around the heartland with its core in the Russian Narod, is much broader than contemporary Russia. To some degree, practically all the countries of the Commonwealth of Independent States, CIS, belong to it. Onto this sociological peculiarity, a strategic factor is superimposed. To guarantee its territorial security, Russia must take military control over the center of the zones attached to it, in the south and the west, and in the sphere of the northern Arctic Ocean. Moreover, if we consider Russia a planetary tellurocratic pole, then it becomes apparent that its direct interests extend throughout the Earth and touch all the continents, seas, and oceans. Hence, it becomes necessary to elaborate a global geopolitical strategy for Russia, describing in detail the specific interests relating to each country and each region. 1. Territory, space, or territorial space is how the Russian word Prostranstvo, equivalent to the German Raum, is translated throughout. Tr2 Dugin uses the term Narodnik as synonymous with the German term folk, or peoples. Ed 3 The author distinguishes between Russkaya and Rossiyski, which are both used throughout the Tacit. Reducialand feared, Urnaltikshon.h tefer mormreurs yoon literafortcheter hthaind na triop narrows fetobital haangben ragatu aranoationast faten, ethno. Social identity. Although there is no effective way to convey this in English, where possible, I translate the latter with of the Russian Federation, and otherwise use the term Russian. Tr4 Alexander Dugin, Geopolitics, Moscow, Academic Project, 2011. 5 Halford Mackinder, 186114947, was an English geographer, and also director of the London School of Economics. A pioneer who established geography as an academic discipline, he is also regarded as the father of geopolitics. Ed 6 Halford Mackinder, Democratic Ideals and Reality, Washington, National Defense University Press, 1996. 7 Friedrich Ratzel, Die Erde und das Leben, Leipzig, Bibliographisches Institut, 1902. Ratzel, 18441904, was a German geographer and ethnologist who attempted to merge the two disciplines, and is regarded as the first German geopolitical thinker. Ed 8 Alexander Dugin, Foundations of Geopolitics, Moscow, Arctogaia, 2000. 9 Ad Piker de Zevo of Mraudsernes Dieselrev Ski en Ugkormainte Otnedenburg Ladruisen. Tiht Iona und Thiesfin Resudrifio Rumiak Fgwov Sikranam Epnritsitat appear on the territory of Russia. It was conquered by the Mongols in the 13th century. Ed 10 The Golden Horde was the name given to the empire that arose in the Slavic regions that were conquered by the Mongolians in the 13th century, after the color of the Mongolians' tents. This kept the area that later became Russia isolated from developments in Europe. Ed 11 Mikhail Leontiev, The Great Game, St. Petersburg, Astral, 2008. 12 George Vernadsky A History of Russia, New Haven, Yale University Press, 1969. 13 Werner Sombart, 18631941, was a German economist and sociologist who was very much opposed to capitalism and democracy. Ed 14 Pidirim Sorokin, 18891968, was a Russian sociologist who was a social revolutionary during the Russian Revolution, and was opposed to communism. He left Russia and lived for the remainder of his life in the United States. Ed 15 Pidirim Sorokin, Social and Cultural Dynamics, Boston, Porter Sargent Publishers, 1970. 16 Peter I, 16721725, or Peter the Great, was the first Tsar to be called Emperor of all Ruasliat Irandoinst. To attend many reforms which led to the development of the Russian Empire. As at 17 among the Russian émigrés who were living in exile following the revolution, the idea of Eurasianism was born, which held that Russia was a distinct civilization from that of Europe, and that the revolution had been a necessary step in giving rise to a new Russia that would be freer of Western, modernizing influences. Ed Chapter 2 The Geopolitics of the USSR The geopolitical background of the 1917 revolution. The end of the Tsarist dynasty did not yet signify the end of the First World War for Russia. And although one of the reasons for the overthrow of the Romanovs was the difficulties of the war and the strain it put on human resources, the economy, and the whole social infrastructure of Russian society, the forces that came to power after the abdication of Nicholas II from the throne, the provisional government one formed mainly on the basis of the Freemasonry of the Duma II and bourgeois parties, continued the course of Russia's participation in the war on the side of the Triple Entente. 3. Geopolitically, this point is decisive. Both Nicholas II and the partisans of the Republican, bourgeois democratic form of government aligned with him were oriented toward England and France. They strove to position Russia in the camp of thalassocratic states. Domestically, there were irreconcilable contradictions between the monarchic model and the bourgeois democratic one, and the escalation of these contradictions led to the overthrow of the dynasty and the monarchy. But in the geopolitical orientation of Nicholas II and the provisional leadership there was, on the contrary, continuity and succession, and orientation toward the civilization of the sea created an affinity between them. For the Tsar this was a practical choice, and for the Februarists, for an ideological one, since England and France were long established bourgeois regimes. On February 25, 1917, By royal decree, the activity of the Fourth State Duma was suspended. On the evening of February 27, a provisional committee of the State Duma was created whose chairman was M.V. Rodzianko, an Octoberist, and chairman of the Fourth Duma. The committee took upon itself the functions and authority of the supreme power. On March 2, 1917, Emperor Nicholas II abdicated, and transferred the right of inheritance to the Grand Duke Michael Alexandrovich V, who, in turn, declared his intention on March 3 to adopt supreme authority only after the will of the people expressed itself in the Constituent Assembly about the final form that the government was to take. On March 2, 1917, the Provisional Committee of the State Duma formed the first Panudbliak doop Mykoks. Tisel na ukloe nad sierunchina page en lenkatuyangst wilskatioenstiden, Trhikrion situatladavnet ansief merb equal, direct, and secret ballots. The old government organs were abolished. At the head of the Provisional Committee was the chairman of the Soviet of Ministers and the Minister of Internal Affairs, Prince G. Lvov, former member of the First State Duma and chairman of the main committee of the All-Russian Zemsky Union. Meanwhile, the Soviet, whose task was to oversee the actions of the provisional government, continued to function. As a consequence, dual power was established in Russia. The Soviets of Workers and Soldiers Deputies 6 were controlled by left-wing parties, which previously remained largely outside the State Duma, Socialists 789 Rpo Lvosilu, Trtiin Baroilis Shavankst, Lzodsabale.d Limwan Kronsti, Armodisnish, Subsikes Sivineldi F. Bolozwivdikas, P. Ryan for Magan orientation. This pro-German orientation was based on a few factors: close cooperation between Bolsheviks and German Marxist Social Democrats, and secret agreements with the Kaiser's intelligence agency about material and technical assistance given to the Bolsheviks. Moreover, the Bolsheviks relied on the disapproval of the war by the broad masses. They based their propaganda on this, formulating it in the spirit of revolutionary ideology, the solidarity of the working classes of all countries and the imperial character of war itself, which opposed the interests of the masses. Hence, the dual power divided between the provisional government and the Soviets, who were under the control of the Bolsheviks from the beginning, in the interval between March and October 1917 reflected two geopolitical vectors, the pro-English and pro-French one for the provisional government, and the pro-German one for the Bolsheviks. This duality also reveals its significance and its character in those historical events that are directly connected with the epoch of the Revolution and the Civil War. On April 18, 1917, the first governmental crisis broke out, ending with the formation of the first coalition government on May 5, 1917, with the participation of the Socialists. Its cause was P. N. Milyukov's 10 April 18 note addressed to England Toned Wferent Koitis Triomikpinat Nanoduan Didkoth Natinthwi Palrelatvhiasio Intail Ranjayat Viunranalma en Ratumo Yuneltskto Natinode been made by the Tsarist government. Here we are dealing with a geopolitical choice that influenced domestic processes. The decision of the provisional government led to popular indignation, which spilled over into mass meetings and demonstrations, with demands for a quick end to the war, the resignation of P. N. Milyukov and A. I. Gukakov 11 and the transfer of power to the Soviets. These disturbances were organized by the Bolsheviks and the Socialist revolutionaries. P. N. Milyukov and A. I. Gukakov left the government. On May 5, an agreement was reached between the Provisional Government and the Executive Committee of the Petrograd Soviet for the creation of a coalition. However, the extreme left parties were not unified around a geopolitical policy. The Bolsheviks held more logically to a pro-German and anti-war line. A part of the Mensheviks and the leftist socialist revolutionaries, whose leaders also often belonged to Masonic organizations, where a pro-French and pro-English orientation dominated, were inclined to support the provisional government, in which the socialist revolutionaries had by then received a few posts. The first All-Russian Congress of Soviets of Workers and Soldiers Deputies, which took place during June 3–4, was dominated by the socialist revolutionaries and the Mensheviks, leading them to support the provisional government and to reject the demand of the Bolsheviks to end the war and transfer power to the Soviets. Then the quick collapse of Russia began. On June 3 a delegation from the provisional government, led by ministers Turchenko and Tsereteli, recognized the autonomy of the Ukrainian Central Rada, UCR. 12 Meanwhile, without the approval of the government, a delegation outlined the geographical limits of the authority of the UCR, including some of the southwestern provinces of Russia. This provoked the July Crisis 13. At the height of the July Crisis, the Finnish Sejm 14 proclaimed the independence of Finland from Russia in its domestic affairs and limited the competence of the provisional government to questions of war and foreign policy. Because of the crisis, a second coalition government was formed with the Social Roskvooploietio and Taortileo.ffse.v Kenerpians STKSU 9th SSHGA org v.Arensmakinalti.st Revolutionaries and Mensheviks. The Social Revolutionary Kerensky, who was also in the group of Trudoviks, Narodai Socialists, was a prominent figure in the Russian Freemasonry of the Duma, a member of the Little Bear Lodge, and a secretary of the secret congregative Masonic organization, the Supreme Soviet of the Great East of the Peoples of Russia. Kerensky held to a pro-English orientation and was closely connected to English Freemasonry. On September 1, 1917, with the goal of opposing the Petrograd Soviet, Kerensky formed a new organ of power, the Directory, Soviet of Five, which proclaimed Russia a republic and dissolved the Fourth State Duma. On September 14, 1917, the All-Russian Democratic Conference was opened, which had to decide the question of the ruling authority, with the participation of all political parties. The Bolsheviks left it in protest. On September 25, 1917, Kerensky formed the Third Coalition Government. On the night of October 26, 1917, on behalf of the Soviets, the Bolsheviks, anarchists, and leftist socialist revolutionaries overthrew the provisional government and arrested its members. Kerensky fled. Significantly, he was helped by English diplomats, in particular Bruce Lockhart 15, and was sent to England, where, from his very arrival, he was active in English Masonic lodges. Geopolitically, the October Bolshevik Revolution, which different historical schools and representatives of various worldviews evaluate in different ways today, was special because it signified an abrupt change in the orientation of Russia's foreign policy from a thalassocratic to a tellurocratic one. Nicholas II and the Masonic Republicans of the Duma from the provisional government had held an Anglo-French orientation and were faithful to the Entente. The Bolsheviks were unequivocally oriented toward peace with Germany and departure from the Entente. After the disbandment of the Constituent Assembly 16, where the Bolsheviks did not receive the support necessary to fully legalize their seizure of authority, authority was transferred to the Council of People's Commissars, where the Bolsheviks dominated. Then, the leftist socialist revolutionaries were their allies. Reproizentmate says O3F, 1th9e18c, Ian Striplerpadoaparisik, Iga Egramium Ni Antob Setruo Henonthgirib Odolshworkvikais, and Bulgaria, was concluded at Brest-Litovsk, signifying Russia's exit from the First World War. According to the terms of the agreement, the Privoslinskie provinces, Ukraine, those provinces with a primarily Belarusian population, the province of Estonia, the province of Courland, the province of Livonia, the Grand Principality of Finland, the Kars district, and the Batumsk district on the Caucasus were all torn away from Russia's west. The Soviet leadership promised to halt the war with the Ukrainian Central Soviet, Rada, of the Ukrainian People's Republic, to demobilize the army and fleet, to remove the Baltic Fleet from its bases in Finland and the Baltic states, to transfer the Black Sea Fleet with all its infrastructure to the Central States, and to pay out 6 million marks in reparations. A territory of 780,000 square kilometers, comprising a population of 56 million people, a third of the population of the Russian Empire, was seized from Soviet Russia. At the same time, Russia brought all its troops out of the designated areas, while Germany, on the other hand, brought its troops in and retained control over the Monzunsky archipelago and the Gulf of Riga. Such was the enormous price that Soviet Russia, in part because it expected an imminent proletarian revolution in Germany and other European countries, paid for its pro-German orientation. The Brest Treaty was immediately rejected by the leftist socialist revolutionaries, a part of whose leadership was oriented toward France and England from former times. As a sign of protest against the conditions of the armistice, the leftist socialist revolutionaries left the Council of People's Commissars. At the Fourth Congress of Soviets, they voted against the Brest Treaty. The social revolutionary St. Mstislavsky coined the slogan, "No war, so an uprising," urging the masses to rise up against the German-Austrian occupying forces. On July 5, at the Fifth Congress of Soviets, the leftist socialist revolutionaries again actively came out against the Bolsheviks' policies, condemning the Brest Treaty. On July 6, the day after the opening of the Congress, two leftist socialist revolutionaries, Yakov Blumkin 17 and Nikolai Einard Mrianvm Vyaxiasil Sinopmthoskalul Rafal Slosoy Wanin Katramaran Dinatiri for Kamamthmite Teek, AANCD, A. Nen Triarivchthoit and killed the German ambassador, Merbach. The goal of the socialist revolutionaries was to wreck the agreements with Germany. On July 30, the leftist social revolutionary, B.M. Donskoy, liquidated the general in command of the occupying forces, Echorn, in Kiev. The leader of the leftist socialist revolutionaries, Maria Spiridonova, was sent to the Fifth Congress of Soviets, where she announced that the Russian people are free from Merbach, implying that the pro-German line in Soviet Russia was finished. In response, the Bolsheviks mobilized their forces for the suppression of the leftist social revolutionary uprising, and arrested and executed their leaders. In this there again appeared a distinction in geopolitical orientations, this time, among the radical leftist forces that had seized power in Soviet Russia. The leftist socialist revolutionaries had tried to wreck the pro-German line of the Bolsheviks, but they failed and promptly disappeared as a political force. If we gather all these geopolitical elements together, we get the following picture: Nicholas II, the bourgeois parties and, in part, the leftist socialist revolutionaries, the Freemasons of the Duma, maintained an orientation toward the Entente, and, as a result, toward thalassocracy, while the Bolsheviks consistently pursued a policy of cooperation with Germany and other Central European states, and with Turkey, that is, they came out in favor of tellurocracy. This geopolitical pattern allows us to take a new look at the dramatic events of Russia's history during 1917–1918 and predetermines the developments of the Soviet period. The geopolitics of the Civil War. The Civil War broke out in Russia between 1917 and 1923. We will consider its geopolitical aspects. Although the Civil War was a domestic conflict, in which the citizens of a single government fought, geopolitics and competing ties with foreign powers played a considerable role in it. What we know about the players' geopolitical orientations in the final years of the Tsar's regime and after February and October 1917 already allows us to give a preliminary characterization of the geopolitical processes of the Civil War. In the Civil War, mainly two political parties fought, the Reds, Bolsheviks, and the Whites. 18 As for the Bolsheviks, their ideological, political, and geopolitical identity was clear. They professed Marxism and the dictatorship of the proletariat, came out against the bourgeois order of things, and were geopolitically oriented toward Germany and rigidly opposed to the Entente. From this we immediately see a few tellurocratic traits: orientation toward Germany, the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, rejection of the bourgeois order. Capitalism, as we saw, is sociologically associated with thalassocracy, hostility toward the thalassocratic Entente. We can also say that the Bolsheviks cultivated a Spartan style, asceticism, heroism, and devotion to an idea. The White movement was not as uniform, ideologically or politically. Both those who continued the February trend, the overwhelming majority, and those who supported a return to the monarchy participated in it. Moreover, among the supporters of the February Revolution were representatives of various parties, both right and bourgeois parties, cadets 19 Octobrists, 20 and leftists, socialist revolutionaries, people's socialists, etc. Ideologically, the White Movement represented many forces, whose political ideas were diverse. Only one thing united them, a rejection of Bolshevism and Marxism. The Reds served as a common enemy. But as the Bolsheviks in that historical situation represented tellurocracy, it is perfectly logical that their adversaries, the Whites, would be oriented in the opposite direction, toward thalassocracy. It happened this way in practice, too, because the White Movement as a whole bet on the Entente and on the support of England and France in the struggle against the Bolsheviks. This was part of the logic of the Provisional Government's foreign policy and the policies of the monarchists, who maintained faithfulness to their allies according to the logic of the final stage of Tsarist rule. Only a few, small segments of the White Movement, in particular the Cossack Ataman 21 Krasnov, and the Northern Army, which had been created by the Germans in October 1918 in Pskov and consisted of Russian volunteers, maintained a German orientation, but this was a completely marginal